So first, just to push back on one theme, and I do think that speakers have been nuanced and forthright about how discussing that some of the issues we're talking about, while certainly visibly impacting Muslim communities, have come to impact many others. And you might have heard, for instance, the notion that the contemporary assault on the Bill of Rights started on 9/11. Don't buy it for a second, because speech was criminalized. In fact, speech was statutorily declared terrorism for environmentalists long before 9/11, right? And environmentalists weren't the only targets. We've seen these measures applied to peace activists. We've seen them applied to immigrants, to supporters of Ron Paul, to African Americans, to Latinos, to labor organizers, to military veterans, and participants in the Occupy movement. This is not a Muslim problem. And if you are in solidarity with Muslims, then I absolutely invite you to use that frame if it works for you. But in explaining these issues to the broader public, this might be a newsflash. America at large doesn't care about us, right? What America at large does care about, though, is America. And it's not Muslims who are under the thumb of the national security state. It is America, period. And Americans from all walks of life. So that's one theme I want to leave with you. Jumping onto another theme, just to extend a notion, Glenn is absolutely right about the partisan co-optation of the Democratic Party and its supporters by this president. And I'll try to extend that argument in just a minute. But before we get there, I do want to just note also that we have to expand our lens beyond the White House. The president does not control all of these issues. There is an administrative bureaucracy that encompasses tens of thousands, hundreds of millions, in fact, if you take into account the armed services, millions of people. And without change across the executive branch, the White House and the layers underneath it, and Congress, and quite frankly the federal judiciary, we're not going anywhere, right? This is not about the most recent or the next presidential election. It is much deeper than that. And when we think about the struggle that we face, I've heard a lot of allusions, very appropriate ones, to the Arab Spring. We do not face a struggle that has a great many analogs in American history. The closest analog I can think of is the end of slavery. I hope that this doesn't take the same sort of result, but the point is, this is not an electoral struggle. It has to go much deeper than that. And it has to, thank you. All right, so to jump into the NDAA, and I want to make a quick point here that this is a little bit, indulge me. So in 1968, the parties inverted, right, with respect to race relations. If you've seen the Lincoln movie, you might be struck that Republicans in the film are the agents of emancipation, and the Democrats are its very committed inhibitors. So that transition in 1968 was not immediately apparent. It only became apparent in retrospect. What's happening now under our feet when it's Senator Rand Paul standing on the floor of the Senate saying that due process should apply to all Americans, not just citizens, while Democrats are pushing the line in the Feinstein Amendment that due process should be restored to citizens and long-term permanent residents only. When you have Republicans standing, not exactly to the left, but at least to the more liberty-leaning position of Democrats, there is the very real possibility that Democrats, having been so fearful of confronting the national security state, very soon will become its public standard bearers. And of course, the mainstream Republican Party is not in the same place as Senators Mike Lee and Rand Paul. But if the liberty wing of the Republican Party wins the battle for the GOP soul, get ready for a wholesale inversion of the political spectrum. It gets a little more curious than that. So the distinction between 19th century and 20th century liberalism is interesting to observe here. 19th century liberalism is the recognition that the government can be oppressive, right? We know 19th century liberalism today as libertarianism. 20th century liberalism, what we know as progressivism, is the recognition that the market itself can become abusive. The answer to overweening government power in the 19th century was both checks on government power and decentralized economic influence, the market. But what happens when the market itself becomes a locus of terror? That gets you to progressivism in the 20th century notion. But notice the 20th century liberalism, the effort to free people from the market, is grounded in a liberty value. Democrats who become co-opted by the national security state run the risk of sacrificing the ideological, the philosophical underpinnings of their own ideology. It is a profound, it's like walking out onto thin ice, and that's exactly where mainline Democrats are at right now. And I just want to give everyone in this room a moment of recognition and applause for being here today, because you have put yourself out of the stultified, inadequate, partisan continuum that has chained and strangled our national discourse. And by being here today, you've made yourself part of the solution, so give yourself a hand for being here. I'm going to move a little quickly here. Try to stay with me, okay? And if you have questions, we can talk later. All right, so first, the Hedges case, people are familiar with it. I want to offer just a couple updates there. So it's pending before the Second Circuit. We at the Bill of Rights Defense Committee are working to coordinate amicus briefs in the case. This is a public shout out since we're in the Northeast. Anyone who worked on the Mahana case, we're looking for an amicus brief to explain to the Second Circuit the relevance of the Mahana case to the Hedges case. If that interests you or you know any lawyers involved in the Mahana case, please come talk to me later. On the Feinstein Amendment that was approved by the Senate last week, two quick talking points. So the first, you'll hear, and the Feinstein Amendment, of course, aims to reiterate due process for citizens and long-term permanent residents only. The principal talking point against the Feinstein Amendment is that it invites domestic military deployment. Why? Because it explicitly contemplates domestic military detention without trial for non-citizen immigrants. We have had a quasi-constitutional norm in this country dating to the end of the Civil War prohibiting domestic military deployment. The Feinstein Amendment invites it explicitly. The second thing you might note is that it creates holes in the bottom of the rights bucket in two different dimensions. The first, immigrants' other rights outside the context of detention will erode, and rights to due process for citizens too will begin to erode now that we've had chinks in the armor in both of those norms. The key, while we're waiting for the courts to resolve these issues and while we're waiting for Congress to resolve these issues, I think everyone in the room knows that we have to take these matters into our own hands. Taking it to the states is crucial. I want to contrast very quickly moments in time at this point in the struggle versus the Patriot Act and its subsequent trajectory, and this moment in time versus the detention issues that emerged in the NDAA. So the Patriot Act passed, it was roughly 11 years ago. It's still on the books, but everyone knows what it is, right? One reason for that is because cities and towns and grassroots coalitions all over the country were creating an echo chamber around those issues. The same opportunity presents itself with respect to the NDAA. I would describe the local grassroots activism opposing the Patriot Act as necessary, but alone insufficient. On the NDAA, on the one hand, we have not yet covered the same ground. There's not nearly as many places in which coalitions have emerged. Yet, a year into the Patriot Act, the struggle against the Patriot Act, there were not yet 5 states that had opposed it. There ultimately were 8 in addition to over 400 cities and towns, but there are already 5 states that have taken official action to repudiate domestic military detention under the NDAA. They include red states, like Arizona. They include blue states, like Hawaii and Rhode Island. They include purple states, like Virginia and Michigan. And you see all different parts of the country encompassed in that list, right? America, in microcosm, has already rejected these principles. We need to fan those flames. I look very forward to seeing Connecticut and the surrounding states added to that list very soon. I want to tell a quick story about El Paso County, Colorado, which was the first local jurisdiction to reject military detention under the NDAA, and this happened even before the bill became law. El Paso County, Colorado is not a progressive hotbed. It's a site of 5 military installations, including the Air Force Academy. When the military raises its voice, saying that there is a problem with military detention, the rest of us damn well better pay attention. That tells you something when the voice is coming from the military, and that's where the call for local grassroots resistance to the NDAA started. On COINTELPRO 2.0, I want to share 2 quick pieces here. The first, we are witnessing a triangulation on the First and the Fourth Amendments. At the same time, there has never in human history been a society under more pervasive surveillance than the United States today. The Soviet Union had nothing on us. China in the contemporary age, maybe, but it's unclear. It's the benefit of executive secrecy, I guess. We won't know. But think of it in these terms. At the same time that we are welcoming a resuscitation of the East German Stasi, in the informant regime contemplated, for instance, by the 2008 Attorney General's guidelines, by the subsequent history of the application of the Humanitarian Law Project case and the kinds of predatory prosecutions that Steve might talk about, in the See Something, Say Something campaign. We're witnessing this lateral surveillance from the ground up, right? At the same time, we are being subjected to a high-tech panopticon that also takes many forms. The NSA's warrantless wiretapping scheme, monitoring your emails and your phone calls, fusion centers, which you've all heard about, and the FBI's Joint Terrorism Task Forces. It includes the Secure Communities Initiative. Who here in the room has heard of NGI? If you just take this note, just for the love of God, Google Next Generation Initiative and Secure Communities. Secure Communities is not an immigrant deportation program. It is a ruse. It is a documented ruse, not involving just ICE, but also the FBI, to create a trackable national biometric ID, not confined to immigrants, but everyone. And ESCOM is the leading edge of it. When you talk to non-immigrant populations, the same way that it makes sense to talk about America. Okay, so I'm going to save a lot of what I was going to say. I would just say be strategic in your messaging. There are ways to make the biometric regime in particular applicable to all Americans. I'll invite somebody to talk about the Justice Act and the Material Support Standard if there's time for that. I'd love to share a little bit about what right-brain public education can look like, but we'll save that for the last panel. Thanks for being here.